Hi, Myles. It's really great to be in conversation with you today as part of the Oxford Net Zero Rockstars series of conversations. I know our wonderful listeners are going to be really interested in hearing a little bit more about you and your journey and your research. And so maybe I can start with an opening question, which is a little bit about how you became involved in climate work. And if you felt so inclined, maybe something about you that we wouldn't otherwise see on your CV or your bio.
Well, I first got involved in climate work, I guess, when I was working for the UN Environment Programme back in the late 1980s, and I was working for the Energy Unit then. And it's funny to think now, but at that time, Jim Hanson's testimony before Congress was sort of novel and controversial, and clearly it was an issue for the Energy Unit in the United Nations Environment Programme to think about. So I did a little bit of work on it with them. I was just there as an intern, but then it became clear that if I was going to do anything in this, I needed to get a PhD. So I came back to Oxford to do that.
Well, great. And I feel like you've been in Oxford now for a while, having done that PhD.
Not quite continuously. I'd like to defend myself there. No, I did my doctorate here. And that wasn't particularly on human-induced climate change. It was on, natural climate variability, El Nino, interdecadal oscillations in climate, that sort of thing. And actually, I first really got into working on human influence on climate. Oddly, perhaps for some people, working in MIT, I had a personal reason. I needed to go to Boston because my wife had got herself a postdoc. Well, she was my fiancée at the time, but had got herself a postdoc in Harvard. So I had to find myself something to do in Boston. So I got myself a NOAA postdoc fellowship at MIT. And my host was one Richard Lindzen, who people may have heard of. He's a very eminent meteorologist, but he's also very well known to people as one of the strongest critics of the consensus view on human influence on climate. So I spent a year and a half in his group. If you look at the record, you'll find we didn't manage to publish any papers together, but I don't know, maybe I served a useful purpose. He kind of knew where my sympathies lay. So every time somebody said something he disagreed with, he'd wander into my office and tear a strip off me and go back to his office afterwards. I don't know whether he felt better after that, and vent to the Wall Street Journal. Anyway, but that sort of got me really interested in the whole question of human influence on climate and what we could and couldn't say about it, because there seemed to be a lot of people with very strong, clear views, perhaps going beyond the evidence at that time. So I then spent probably the next decade or so really focused on what the evidence really did tell us.
Oh, super cool. And I actually really like in your story that, what brought you to Boston was your relationship. And I think that's a really nice sort of human element. Again, not something you would necessarily see on your bio or your profile, but I love that idea that you sort of followed with your partner where to be. And, who knows what sort of routes you follow when you follow, where your heart is leading you to go in through that partnership. So that's wonderful. And I imagine there's some people that might be thinking a little bit about where their roots might be going when it comes to being in a partnership. So Myles, I want to ask you a little bit more about where you go for inspiration in the work you're doing. So I feel like lots of people go different places when they need sort of a boost of energy or a chance to power up, or just a sort of sense of like the inspiration to fuel the work that they do. So what do you do? Where do you go when you need to find that sort of source to go further, faster?
I mean, increasingly, I find my job is just following things to their logical conclusion. So I find myself over the past year, actually, one thing about being in lockdown, but also owning a dog, is that you, for the first time in our lives, you spend quite a lot of time sort of forcibly away from a screen and not able to take notes or write stuff down because you're walking the dog or whatever. And so I've found myself with plenty of time to try and construct what I understand about something in my head as simply as I can, because I'm getting less good at retaining lots of things in my head at one time. reaching a certain age, perhaps. And so that drives me to be thinking about simplifying things. And I think that's important, because I think we tend, one of the things that I hate most about academics being interviewed is how often we slip into the habit of saying, oh, it's all terribly complicated, because that makes us sound important. And often it's not entirely true. I mean, there's a lot about the climate issue that's really very, very simple. And we need to get that across to people. And we need to be thinking hard about how we can reduce things. As Einstein put it, we need to make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I've been spending a lot of time over the past year really thinking about that challenge.
Well, I love that. As someone else who has a dog newly through this sort of pandemic period of lockdown, I really know what you mean in terms of sort of those long walks where you just sort of take everything in, and sort of having that ability to sort of think widely and think simply actually is I think something that I really appreciate as part of your journey and your story. And I really understand that that's a place where you can get sort of some new insight when it comes to the work you're doing. Wonder if we could switch gears a little bit, because I'd love to hear a little bit more about what big questions you're exploring right now in the research you're doing.
So, I mean, the background to a lot of my work, of course, was the work we did in the 2000s on carbon dioxide, and the fact that cumulative carbon dioxide emissions drive global temperatures, which is why we need to get to net zero in the first place. And I mean, and a lot of the work over the past few years has been around how we bring other greenhouse gases into that equation, assuming we do something about fossil fuel emissions, which is a big assumption. They're still going up, but we're making plans to reduce them. Then as soon as we start reducing carbon dioxide emissions, other greenhouse gases, of course, become relatively much more important. And it's lots of people are pointing out we need to do something about methane, we need to do things about black carbon emissions, we need to take action on nitrous oxide. This is all absolutely true. And taking action on all these different fronts is complicated at the moment by the fact that we don't really have a simple way of understanding how all of their influence comes together to affect global temperature. So, in pursuit of a global temperature goal, we need to understand how different human influences on climate affect temperature. Now, we do understand this in the sense we understand it very well in climate models, but that's not terribly useful to people. You've got to be able to explain to them, and this does this and that does that, and avoid saying, oh, it's all very complicated. So I've been spending a lot of time trying to work out how to do that so that everybody can understand how different activities affect global temperature. And so that's been a big focus, one of the big focuses of my work over the past year.
Cool. Well, and within that, everybody, I think, I imagine businesses are sort of a community within that sort of constituency of people that are needing to sort of take steps and engage on this. So I wondered if you have any thoughts specifically on ways in which you'd like to see your research being applied by business, by the private sector.
Yeah, well, most businesses really only emit carbon dioxide. I mean, that's why, so what I was just talking about is, to some extent, it's very important for some businesses, any business involved in agriculture particularly, but for the vast majority of businesses, no, it's about carbon. And that's remarkably simple. You've got to work out how to get your carbon dioxide emissions to net zero. And that's an area which I've also been rather drawn into. I guess this time last year, you probably couldn't have predicted I'd have been quite so interested in offsetting and how offsetting works, but I know that's something that businesses are very concerned about. And I've been drawn into the discussions of offsetting because it's clearly going to become a big issue in business planning for net zero. And, Ben Calder's got us going on the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Offsetting in September last year. And that really kicked off quite a useful global discussion. I think it's been useful, certainly been useful for us, learning what lots of different people are thinking about this area. And it's forced me to think pretty hard about what is and is not reasonable to ask about the whole process of balancing emissions, even at the carbon dioxide to carbon dioxide level, because while there's extra complications when you're balancing emissions of different greenhouse gases. Even if you're trying to, offset ongoing fossil fuel emissions by planting trees, for example, there are things you need to recognize about that kind of activity, which I think some businesses appreciate, and I think it'd be great if we get them more broadly understood.
Well, and it's interesting that getting things more broadly understood leads me to be curious about a question about the future and your view of where you think things are going next. And I'd like to actually put a specific date to it, because I feel like within the B Corp community, we have a group of businesses that are making net zero by 2030 commitments. We've got the Sustainable Development Goals, which are linked to 2030. I wonder what you think the world's going to look like in 2030 when it comes to the sorts of research you're doing and the engagement you're seeing with a wide range of constituencies.
Well, obviously, I hope by 2030, we'll see global fossil fuel emissions in particular going down. We've got to start reducing fossil fuel emissions. And what worries me is, and the reason that's still only a hope, is they're still going up, and we still seem to be proving past masters at finding other things to talk about. It was striking a couple of years ago at one of the UNFCCC conferences of the parties. We did a quick tally and worked out there were 5 times as many side events at that meeting talking about nature and trees as there were talking about fossil fuels. Now, people want to talk about nature and trees. That's so much more fun to talk about than fossil fuels. But at the end of the day, it's fossil fuels that are driving the problem. We've got to keep talking about the elephants in the corner. We can't just keep finding ways of distracting ourselves. And so that's what worries me, is that we need to get the global production of CO2 from fossil fuels down. We need to start getting rid of carbon dioxide that is still being generated by fossil fuels, because we know we're going to generate too much and therefore need to get rid of it in some way other than dumping it into the atmosphere. That's got to be ramped up. And that's really the big equation that has to be going on over the next few decades. And so I just hope we'll be already on a path to ramping up what we store and ramping down what we produce, and not continuing to distract ourselves with relatively peripheral arguments. I think a good test for any business person who's being, given a new climate solution, it's the 1/10 of a degree test. It's like, okay, so how many 1/10ths of a degree is this worth by mid-century? Whatever it is you're being told is very important for climate change. And if the answer's around 1/10 or less, it's like, okay, bear in mind, fossil fuel emissions are driving up global temperatures by 2/10 of a degree per decade. So keep it in perspective. Yes, this might be a great thing to do, but it's not a solution to the problem.
I like that. It's a very practical sort of way to be thinking about this if you're in business. Well, we imagine there's going to be quite a few students that are going to be tuning into these conversations. So I wondered, Myles, if you've got any advice for some of the young people that are showing up on campus, taking a range of different programs, let's be honest, across Oxford. What sort of things do you think they should be looking out for, engaging in, experimenting with when it comes to sort of their approach to learning? What advice do you have them?
If you're concerned about climate change, it's back to the 1/10 of a degree test. Do the big stuff. Yes, the little stuff is important, and some people have to worry about it. But my big concern is we've got 80% of our effort at the moment is being spent on 20% of the problem, and the 80% of the problem, which is fossil CO2 emissions, is getting the wrong level of effort. It is the next generation that's going to have to sort this out. And so for students, I would in particular want them to engage with, how can they, through their career, through their work, make the most difference to this fundamental challenge we have, which is stopping fossil fuels from causing global warming. That's if you think about the problem in that way, how can what I'm doing stop fossil fuels from causing global warming globally? That's ultimately what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to do lots of other things as well, but one thing we will absolutely have to do is to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming.
Yep. the expression that kind of went through my head while you were speaking is like, we got to go big or go home. But then actually it's about not going home. It's about going big, or else we don't have a home.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and we've got to solve the big stuff. Yes, we can solve the little stuff too, but in the end, the big stuff needs to get solved. And many of the solutions, you know, don't. And again, this is a difficult one for students who, of course, need to find novelty in everything they do because they need to find a new angle in order to write a dissertation about something and so on. Many of the big problems have been around for a while, and we know what the answer is, but we just got to stick at it. So again, don't be, and this is a tricky one for students again, but don't shy away from something just because it's obvious and it's been obvious for a while. You've just got to keep saying it, but say it, you know, in a new context, in a new year. It's in a post-COVID world. It's still important to go over what it means and why and what we have to do about it. So, you know, an obvious thing that's been obvious for a decade, we're going to have to get rid of CO2. We're going to have to find safe ways of disposing of carbon dioxide permanently rather than dumping it into the atmosphere. We've known that for 30 years. If you go back to the carbon, whatever they were called, the carbon dossiers and so on, they found it. And Exxon was talking about this in the early 1980s. They recognized that they couldn't just keep dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. They're going to find other things to do with it. So it's not as if this is a great new insight, but what does it mean now? What do we have to do in order to make that happen? That's a big part of Oxford Net Zero.
Mm-hmm. And recognizing like we need actually a whole range of solutions. Like this is a moment where there's, yes, we need to go big, and yes, we need to be focusing on these things, but actually we're at a point where we need as many different things as possible to sort of swarm in and crowd in to address these challenges.
It's true, but I'm a little I'm a little wary of anything which sounds like, oh, it's very complicated, and oh, we need to do everything is a little bit like, oh, it's very complicated. We need to do one thing, which is to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming. If we manage to do that, then we've largely solved the problem. Yes, we need to stop deforestation from causing global warming. Yes, we need to stop the global loss of biodiversity. Yes, there's so many other things we need to do as well. But we absolutely have to work out how to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming. And when you sort of work backwards, so how do we stop fossil fuels from global warming? Well, you stop the carbon dioxide which they generate from being dumped into the atmosphere. Okay, follow that through. What else are we going to do with it? Follow that through, and you realize what you have to do to solve the problem.
Well, we are almost at time here, Myles, and the last question I would like to ask you actually is a kind of tribute to the topic of these sort of interviews, which is, you know, calling it the Oxford Net Zero Rockstars. And one of the things we're keen to do is just to understand what is sort of the music that's playing in the background while you're doing the kind of work that we're doing. So my last question to you, Myles, is what do you listen to? What sort of music do you find you get moving to when it comes to either doing Net Zero or beyond?
I think for this era, my music tastes are probably pretty embarrassing because I came of age in the 1980s, so I'm still pretty. That was the backing track of my student days, and I find it hard to leave that behind. But anyway,
is there any song
if you want to play me out on Blondie, I'll be all right.
All right. Well, excellent. Thanks so much for your time, Myles. Really appreciate it. And if anyone's interested in learning more about what Myles is researching, the sorts of big questions and simple approaches to addressing these challenges, definitely tune in to the updates on the Oxford Net Zero website. So thanks so much, Myles.
Thank you, Shah.